The transmission on the 94 Peterbilt had been grinding for 3 days before Martinez finally brought it in. I remember sliding under the chassis on my creeper, smelling diesel and old grease, thinking about how the guy always waited until something was about to catastrophically fail before he showed up at the shop. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. That particular frequency that gets into your skull after 8 hours and doesn't leave until you've had 3 beers and fallen asleep in front of the television. Windrider, you got a minute? That was Carl, my supervisor, a thick-necked man from Green Bay who'd been running the maintenance bay at Hawkins Trucking for 22 years. He stood at the edge of my work area, clipboard in hand, which meant paperwork, which meant nothing good. I rolled out from under the Peterbilt, wiping my hands on a rag that was already more oil than cloth. What's up? You put in for time off again, 3rd weekend this month. Cabin needs work, roof's leaking, foundation's got cracks. If I don't get up there before winter, the whole thing's gonna be a loss. Carl scratched at his jaw, that particular gesture he made when he was about to say something he didn't want to say. Look, I get it. Your grandpa left you the place. You feel obligated. But I got roots that need trucks, and I got trucks that need mechanics. Denny's out with his back again, and Fisher's wife just had twins. I'm not asking for a vacation, Carl. 2 days. I'll work doubles next week to make up for it. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating. How much trouble was I worth? How much could he push before I started looking for work elsewhere? I was good at what I did. Not the best, but reliable, thorough. The kind of mechanic who actually fixed problems instead of just making them quiet for a few months. Fine, he said finally, but you're on call. Anything comes up, you haul your ass back here. Understood? He walked away, and I slid back under the Peterbilt. But my mind was already 200 miles north, in the Chequamegon Nicolet National Forest, where my grandfather's cabin sat rotting among the white pines. I'd inherited the place 6 months ago, along with a 1987 Ford F-150 that barely ran, and a hunting dog named Sadie, who was 16 years old and mostly deaf. Grandpa Eli had died in his sleep at the nursing home in Madison, and I'd been the one to sort through his things, because my mother, his daughter, had passed 5 years earlier, and my father had never been in the picture. The lawyer had handed me a manila envelope with the deed and a handwritten note that said only, "The cabin is yours now. You'll understand someday." I didn't understand. I still don't. Not really, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The drive from Madison to the cabin took about 4 hours if you pushed it, 3.5 if you really pushed it, and didn't hit construction on 51. I made the trip every other weekend, loading up the truck with supplies, lumber, roofing tar, caulk, whatever I could afford, from that paycheck's leftovers after rent and utilities and the minimum payments on credit cards I'd run up during the months I'd spent unemployed after the last shop closed. Amy thought I was crazy. She'd said so multiple times in that particular tone she used when she was trying to be supportive but couldn't quite manage it. "It's a shack in the middle of nowhere," she'd said the night before, standing in my apartment kitchen with her arms crossed while I packed a cooler. "You spent more on that place in 6 months than it'll ever be worth." "It's not about what it's worth." "Then what's it about, Nate? Because I've barely seen you in weeks. You come home smelling like sawdust and bug spray. You fall asleep on the couch, and then you're gone again." I'd stopped packing then, looked at her. Amy Chen, 5'4", dark hair cut short in a practical bob, wearing scrubs from her shift at the hospital. We'd been together 2 years, lived in separate apartments, because neither of us was ready for more. And lately I'd been wondering if we ever would be. My grandfather built that cabin with his own hands, I said. Lived there every summer for 40 years. Hunted there, fished there. And then one day he just stopped going and nobody knows why. 15 years, Amy. He never went back, never talked about it, just let the place fall apart. I want to know why. Maybe he just got old. People get old, they can't do the things they used to do. He was 62 when he stopped going. He didn't get old until the last few years. She'd sighed. That particular sigh that meant she was giving up the argument, but not conceding the point. Just be careful, okay? There's no cell service up there, and you're miles from the nearest hospital. I'll be careful. I wasn't careful. Not careful enough anyway. But that's the thing about what happened. Careful wouldn't have mattered. Nothing I could have done would have mattered except maybe staying away entirely. And even then, I'm not sure. That Friday night, I made it to the cabin just before dark. Sadie riding shotgun with her gray muzzle resting on the windowsill. The access road was a 1/4 mile of rutted gravel that wound through dense stands of pine and birch, and the truck bounced and groaned over every pothole. The cabin sat in a small clearing, maybe half an acre of scrubby grass surrounded by forest on 3 sides and a steep ravine on the 4th. Beyond the ravine, the land dropped away toward a creek that you could hear but rarely see through the undergrowth. I parked by the woodpile and sat there for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the place. It was small, maybe 800 square feet if you counted the covered porch, with cedar siding that had gone silver with age, and a green metal roof that was mostly rust now. The windows were cloudy. The door hung slightly crooked, and the whole structure had a quality of patient neglect, like an old dog waiting for its owner to come home. Sadie didn't want to get out of the truck. That should have been my first warning. I chalked it up to her age, her arthritis, the unfamiliar place. She'd been a puppy when Grandpa Eli had stopped coming here. Maybe too young to remember specifics, but old enough that something might have imprinted deep. I carried her to the porch, set her down on the weathered boards, and went back for my gear. The cabin smelled like dust and mouse droppings and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that I couldn't identify. I'd cleaned the place out on my first visit, swept and scrubbed and thrown away years of accumulated debris, but the smell persisted. Old wood, maybe? Old memories? I worked until midnight that first night, replacing boards on the porch that had gone soft with rot. The work was good, physical, the kind of labor that emptied your mind and let you exist purely in the moment. Measure, cut, nail. Measure, cut, nail. The rhythm of it, the satisfying thunk of the hammer, the smell of fresh-cut pine mixing with the cool night air. Sadie stayed inside the whole time, curled up on the old braided rug by the fireplace, watching me through the open door, with eyes that seemed somehow accusing. Saturday morning I woke to silence. Not the peaceful silence of a lazy morning, but an active silence. A silence that felt like something was missing. I lay there in my sleeping bag on the old iron bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what was wrong. Then I realized, no birds. The forest around the cabin should have been alive with sound at dawn. Woodpeckers and jays and chickadees, the whole chorus of northern Wisconsin morning. Instead, there was nothing. Not a single chirp, Not a single flutter of wings against branches. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe there'd been a hawk in the area, some predator that had scattered the songbirds. Maybe it was just one of those things. Nature was full of anomalies that seemed strange to human observers but made perfect sense in the larger ecology. I made coffee on the camp stove and took Sadie outside to do her business. She went quickly, squatting in the grass 3 feet from the porch, then scrambled back toward the door before I could even finish my first sip. That was when I smelled it. Something dead. Something close. The smell was coming from the north, where the tree line pressed closest to the cabin. I set down my coffee and walked toward it, Sadie whimpering behind me. And what I found there stopped me cold. A deer? A doe, maybe 2 years old from the look of her, lying in a patch of ferns about 30 yards into the trees. She'd been torn apart, not eaten, not scavenged, but systematically dismembered. Her legs lay in a rough rectangle around the torso. Her organs had been removed and arranged in a circle, the heart at the center, the liver and kidneys placed at cardinal points, like some kind of grotesque compass. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my coffee growing cold in my forgotten hand, trying to process what I was seeing. Bears didn't do this. Wolves didn't do this. No predator I knew of killed this way, with this kind of deliberate arrangement. A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the morning sun. I thought about cult activity, maybe some kids from town playing at something they didn't understand. But the cabin was miles from anywhere, and there were no tire tracks on the access road besides my own. I remembered thinking, and I remember this clearly, the exact words that went through my mind, that there had to be a rational explanation. There was always a rational explanation. The world was full of strange things, but they all had causes. They all made sense if you knew enough about them. I didn't know enough. I know that now. But at the time, standing there in the morning light with the smell of death filling my nostrils and the silence pressing in from all sides, I still believed that understanding was possible. The birds never came back that day. Not one. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and the distant murmur of the creek, and once, around midday, what might have been a branch breaking somewhere deep in the forest. Too loud for a squirrel, too irregular for a tree falling. Like a footstep, but heavier. Much heavier. I told myself it was a deer. I told myself a lot of things that weekend. Sunday morning, I drove into town to report what I'd found. Hayward was 40 minutes south, a small place that swelled with tourists during fishing season and shrank to a skeleton crew the rest of the year. The DNR office was in a low brick building next to the post office, staffed by a woman at the front desk and a single wildlife officer who came out when I explained what I'd seen. His name was Dale Hendricks, according to the brass nameplate on his uniform. A thin man in his 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that didn't quite meet mine. Deer carcass, you say? Arranged how? I described it again, the way the organs had been placed, the geometric precision of the dismemberment. Hendricks took notes on a yellow legal pad, his handwriting small and cramped. And you're out at the Windrider cabin? Eli's place? You knew my grandfather. Everyone knew Eli. He said it flatly, without elaboration. How long you been going up there? 6 months. Since he passed. Hendricks made a sound that might have been acknowledgement, might have been something else. I'll come out, take a look. You going to be there? I'm heading back to Madison this afternoon, but I'll be up again in 2 weeks. I'll leave a report in your mailbox. He drove out that afternoon, a green DNR pickup bouncing up the access road while I was loading my gear. I walked him to the deer carcass. It was already starting to bloat in the warmth, the smell thickening, and watched his face as he looked at it. Something changed in his expression. A tightening around the eyes, a set to the jaw that hadn't been there before. He took photos with a digital camera, quick and efficient, then stepped back and looked around at the trees. Probably a bear, he said, but his voice had gone hollow. Bears don't arrange organs in circles. You'd be surprised what animals do. Scavengers move things around. Coyotes play with their food. It looks deliberate, but it's just chaos. Random pattern recognition. The coyotes have been quiet. Haven't heard them all weekend. Hendricks looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time, and I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't identify. Fear, maybe, or resignation. Animals are animals, he said. They do what they do. Best not to read too much into it. He left without saying goodbye, his truck kicking up dust on the access road. I stood on the porch watching him go, Sadie pressed against my legs, trembling. 2 weeks later, I found his report in the mailbox. 1 page, typed, official letterhead. Probable predation by black bear, carcass disposed of. No further action required. It was signed but not dated. And when I called the DNR office to ask questions, the woman at the front desk told me that Officer Hendricks had taken early retirement. When? I asked. Last week, said he'd had enough of the North Woods. I went to the hardware store after that, a place called Larson's that had been selling supplies to hunters and cabin owners since before my grandfather was born. The man behind the counter was old, 80 if he was a day, with liver-spotted hands and eyes the color of lake ice. You're Eli's grandson, he said before I could introduce myself. How'd you know? You look like him, got his jaw. He rang up my purchases, caulk, wood screws, a new padlock for the shed. Heard you're fixing up the place. Trying to, it's a lot of work. Eli let it go on purpose, you know. Wasn't just neglect. I paused in the act of pulling out my wallet. What do you mean? The old man shrugged, a gesture that seemed to convey nothing and everything at once. Woods are woods. Things live in them that don't make sense to people. Your granddad knew that. Knew it better than most. What things? But he just shook his head and handed me my change, and when I pressed him, he said only, Eli was smart. He stopped asking questions. You might want to consider doing the same. I didn't stop asking questions. That was my mistake. One of many, but I couldn't help it. The deer carcass, the silent birds, the way Hendricks had looked at those woods, the old man's cryptic warnings. Something was happening at the cabin, something my grandfather had understood well enough to run from, and I needed to know what it was. That night, back in Madison, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the normal sounds of the city, cars passing, a distant siren, the hum of the refrigerator, and thought about the silence of the forest. The absolute, oppressive silence that had pressed against my ears like a physical weight. Sadie slept at the foot of the bed, twitching in her dreams, whimpering softly. I wondered what she remembered about the cabin. I wondered what she could sense that I couldn't. Amy called around midnight, just as I was finally drifting off. You're back, she said. I saw your truck in the lot. Got in a few hours ago. How was the cabin? I almost told her. The words were right there, crowding against my teeth. The deer, the silence, the way the wildlife officer had looked at those trees. But I swallowed them back because how do you explain something like that? How do you make someone understand a feeling, a wrongness, when you don't understand it yourself? Same as always, I said. Lot of work to do. You sound tired. I am tired, Nate. Her voice softened in that way it did when she was worried. If something's wrong, you can tell me. You know that, right? I know. Nothing's wrong, just a long weekend. She didn't believe me. I could hear it in her silence, in the way she sighed before saying goodnight. But she didn't push, and I didn't volunteer. And that's how the distance between us grew. One small silence at a time. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of transmissions and brake jobs and routine maintenance. I worked my doubles as promised, stayed late, came in early, tried to lose myself in the simple mechanics of diesel engines. But every night I dreamed about the cabin, about the circle of organs gleaming wetly in the morning light, about the silence that fell over the forest like a funeral shroud. I started doing research on my lunch breaks, scrolling through forums about unexplained animal deaths in northern Wisconsin. Most of what I found was garbage, conspiracy theories, cryptid enthusiasts, people who'd watched too many horror movies. But occasionally there was something else, a story that felt different, a first-hand account that had the ring of genuine fear. A hunter near Rice Lake who'd found a circle of rabbit skulls arranged around a tree stump. A couple camping in the Chequamegon who'd woken to find their tent surrounded by deer tracks. Just tracks, no deer. The prints forming a perfect circle around where they slept. A fisherman on the Flambeau River who swore he'd seen something swimming beneath his canoe. Something bigger than any fish. Something with eyes that reflected the light wrong. None of it proved anything. All of it terrified me. I bought trail cameras. 4 of them. High-end units with night vision and motion sensors. The kind that hunters use to scout game before the season. I also picked up a cheap satellite communicator. One of those handheld units that could send texts and make short calls from anywhere, even places with no cell towers. Amy's warning about no service had stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. If something was coming to the cabin, something that left deer carcasses as calling cards, I wanted to see it. I needed to see it. Amy thought I was losing my mind. She didn't say it in so many words, but I could see it in the way she looked at me when I showed her the cameras. Could hear it in the careful neutrality of her voice. You're spending a lot of money on this, she said. I need to know what's out there. It's probably a bear. The wildlife officer said it was a bear. The wildlife officer quit his job a week after he saw it. She didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. I drove up on a Friday, same as always. Sadie riding shotgun with that look of canine resignation that meant she knew where we were going and didn't like it. The access road was the same. The cabin was the same. But something had changed in the clearing. Something I couldn't identify at first. Just a feeling of wrongness that settled into my bones the moment I stepped out of the truck. Then I saw the tree. A birch, maybe 50 feet tall, standing at the edge of the clearing, near where I'd found the deer. Its bark had been stripped in long vertical gouges, pale wood showing beneath, and the gouges went up the trunk as far as I could see. 10 feet, 12 feet, higher than any bear could reach, even standing. I walked to the tree and ran my fingers along the marks. They were deep, maybe half an inch into the wood and spaced evenly apart. 4 parallel lines, then a gap, then 4 more. like fingers, like hands, but the span was wrong. Each set of marks was almost a foot across, the individual grooves spaced 3 inches apart. No bear had paws that size. No animal I knew of had paws that size. I set up the cameras that afternoon, positioning them to cover all approaches to the cabin. One on the porch, one on the woodpile, one facing the tree line, one watching the ravine. I checked and double-checked the batteries, the memory cards, the motion sensor ranges. If anything moved within 50 feet of the cabin, I would have footage of it. That night I sat on the porch with my grandfather's old Remington side by side across my knees, watching the darkness beyond the clearing. Sadie was inside, refusing to come out, and I couldn't blame her. The silence was back, deeper than before, an absence of sound so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears. Around midnight, the coyotes started up. Not close, somewhere on the ridge to the east, but their howling was strange, wrong somehow. Broken rhythms, pitches that slid up and down the scale in ways that didn't sound natural, and beneath it all, something else. A lower sound, too deep to be a coyote, too regular to be wind. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch with the shotgun until dawn, watching the trees, and nothing emerged from them. But when I checked the cameras the next morning, 2 of them were dead. No footage, no timestamps, just blank memory cards and batteries that had drained completely overnight. The other 2 had recorded normally, hours of empty clearing. The only motion a leaf blowing across the frame. One of the dead cameras had been facing the clawed tree. The other had been watching the ravine. I packed up that afternoon and drove back to Madison faster than I should have, Sadie trembling in the passenger seat the whole way. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was nothing in those woods that couldn't be explained by science and reason and the normal behavior of animals. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something in the forest had seen the cameras, had known what they were, had wanted me to know that it knew. And for the first time since I'd inherited the cabin, Chequamegon, I started to wonder if my grandfather had been right to run. I didn't tell Amy about the cameras. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That something had selectively drained the batteries on 2 trail cameras while leaving the others untouched? That whatever was out there seemed to know exactly which angles would have captured it? She already thought I was obsessing over the cabin, turning grief into some kind of fixation. Adding paranoia to the mix would only confirm what she was already thinking. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop turning it over in my mind during the long hours under trucks and trailers, my hands working on autopilot while my brain chewed on the problem like a dog with a bone. The gouges on the tree, the arranged organs, the silence that fell over the forest like a held breath. There had to be an explanation, a rational framework that could contain all of it, and I was going to find it. I worked through the list methodically, the way I'd troubleshoot a bad engine. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, feral dogs, even the possibility of some deranged hermit living in the woods. None of it fit. Bears clawed trees but couldn't reach 12 feet. Wolves didn't arrange organs in circles. No animal drained camera batteries. And no person could have made that particular silence fall over the forest. That primal wrongness that settled into your bones like a sickness. Whatever was out there, it wasn't anything I could find in a wildlife database or a true crime forum. I called the DNR office again, asking about Hendricks, asking if anyone else had reported strange animal behavior in the area. The woman who answered, different from before, younger sounding, told me that Officer Hendricks had left no forwarding information and that there had been no unusual reports filed in the past 6 months. Her voice was clipped, professional, with an undertone that suggested she'd been instructed not to discuss certain things. "What about the deer carcass?" I pressed. "The one Hendricks investigated at the Windrider cabin?" A pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "I don't have any record of that report, sir." "That's impossible." "He came out, took photos, filed a 1-page report. I have a copy of it." "I'm sorry, sir. There's nothing in our system matching that description. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" I hung up without answering, my hands shaking. The report was real. I had it in a folder on my kitchen table, right next to the deed to the cabin and my grandfather's death certificate. But according to the DNR, it didn't exist. Officer Hendricks had investigated something that had never been reported, filed a document that had never been recorded, and then vanished into early retirement without leaving a trace. Someone was covering something up, or everyone was pretending that nothing had happened, which amounted to the same thing. I drove back to Hayward that weekend. Not to the cabin, but to the town itself. I told myself I needed supplies, more caulk, some roofing nails, maybe a new set of work gloves. But what I really needed was answers. Someone in this town knew something. The old man at Larson's had practically admitted it. I just had to find the right person to ask. The hardware store was quiet when I walked in, mid-morning on a Saturday, the kind of time when most people were either working or sleeping off Friday night. The old man wasn't there. A younger guy behind the counter, maybe 40, with the same pale eyes and angular face that suggested a family resemblance. "Help you find something?" "Looking for the owner." "Old guy, worked here a few weeks back." The younger man's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "My father. He passed last Tuesday. Stroke." The words hit me like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "No reason you would." He rang up a customer who'd materialized behind me, a woman buying birdseed, and I stepped aside to wait. When she was gone, he turned back to me with that same flat expression. "You're the Windrider kid, the one fixing up Eli's place. Word travels fast. Small town. Everybody knows everybody's business." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "My father said you'd be back. Said you'd have questions." "Did he say anything else?" "Said you wouldn't like the answers." He glanced toward the door, as if checking to make sure we were alone. "Said I should tell you to sell the place and forget about it. Whatever you saw up there, whatever you think you saw, it's not worth dying over." "What did I see?" He shook his head slowly, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of generations. "Don't know. Don't want to know. My grandfather used to tell stories when I was a kid. Things he'd heard from the old-timers, the loggers who worked these woods 100 years ago. He'd tell them like they were jokes, like they were campfire tales for scaring children. But he never laughed when he told them, and he never went into the forest after dark." "What kind of stories?" "The kind that don't have happy endings." He straightened up, uncrossed his arms. "Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's your land, your cabin, your business. But if I were you, I'd take my father's advice. Sell the place, take whatever you can get for it, and don't look back. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things just are. I bought a pack of batteries and a flashlight I didn't need, just to have something to do with my hands, and drove out of town with more questions than I'd arrived with. The old man was dead. Another person connected to the cabin. Another source of information gone silent. Hendricks had fled to wherever retired DNR officers went to escape their pasts. And the son at the hardware store had given me nothing but warnings and riddles, the kind of cryptic bullshit that made me want to shake someone until they actually told me something useful. But there was one more source I hadn't exhausted. One more person who might have answers, even if he couldn't speak them anymore. My grandfather's journal. I'd found it on my first visit to the cabin, tucked into a drawer in the bedside table, along with a worn Bible and a photograph of my grandmother that I'd never seen before. The journal was old, leather-bound, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. Most of it was mundane. Notes about repairs, lists of supplies, observations about weather and wildlife. But scattered throughout were passages that I hadn't understood at the time, references to things that didn't make sense. Heard it again last night. Closer this time. The pup wouldn't stop whimpering. Found another one by the creek. Arranged the same way. Need to talk to Dale. They don't believe me. Nobody believes. But the silence keeps spreading. I'd read these entries before and dismissed them as the ramblings of an aging mind, the kind of vague paranoia that sometimes crept into people as they got older. But now, sitting in my apartment with the journal spread open on my lap, I saw them differently. My grandfather had experienced the same things I was experiencing. He'd tried to tell people, and they hadn't listened. And eventually he'd stopped trying. The last entry was dated 15 years ago, 3 days before, according to my mother. He'd packed up everything he could fit in his truck and driven away from the cabin for the last time. It knows I've seen it now. Watched it from the window last night. Standing at the tree line, just standing, waiting. The silence is complete. No birds, no insects, nothing. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it wants anything at all, or if watching is enough. But I can't stay here anymore. I can't pretend that this is normal, that the world still makes sense. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things just are. The same words the hardware store owner had used. A phrase passed down through generations, a mantra for dealing with something that couldn't be dealt with. Some things just are. I went back to the cabin 2 weeks later, armed with everything I thought might help. A new set of trail cameras with hardened cases and longer battery life. A notebook for recording observations. My grandfather's shotgun cleaned and loaded with buckshot. Sadie came with me because I couldn't leave her alone in Madison, and because some stupid part of me believed that her fear was a useful indicator, a canary in the coal mine that would warn me if something was wrong. Something was wrong from the moment we arrived. The clearing looked the same: cabin, woodpile, tree line. The clawed birch standing like a sentinel at the forest's edge. But the feeling was different. Heavier. The air seemed to press against my skin, thick with humidity and something else. Something that raised the hair on the back of my neck before I'd even stepped out of the truck. Sadie refused to leave the cab. Not whimpering this time, not trembling, just sitting there with her eyes fixed on the tree line, her body rigid, her breath coming in short, sharp pants. I tried to coax her out with treats, with gentle words, with the leash she'd never needed before. She didn't move, didn't even look at me. I left her in the truck with the windows cracked and walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for signs of disturbance. The clawed tree was the same, the gouges no deeper than before. The spot where I'd found the deer had been reclaimed by undergrowth, new ferns pushing up through the soil, No sign of what had happened there. The cameras I'd left behind were still in place, and when I checked them, all 4 were working. Full batteries, memory cards intact, hours of footage waiting to be reviewed. But when I played the footage back on my laptop that night, there was nothing. Days of empty clearing. The only movement, wind, and rain, and the occasional squirrel darting through the frame. Whatever had drained the first cameras had stayed away while I was gone, or had learned to avoid detection, and this thought chilled me more than the others, had been waiting for me to return. I set up the new cameras anyway, positioning them in different locations, angling them to cover blind spots in the old coverage. I checked the batteries twice, 3 times, obsessively, confirming that everything was working. If something came into that clearing tonight, I would see it. I had to see it. The not knowing was worse than any monster my imagination could conjure. The sun set around 8, the long northern twilight fading slowly into darkness. I made dinner on the camp stove, canned chili, crackers, coffee that tasted like engine oil, and watched the shadows lengthen across the clearing. Sadie was still in the truck, still refusing to move, and I'd given up trying to convince her. If she felt safer there, who was I to argue? I didn't feel safe anywhere. By 10 o'clock, the silence had settled in. That particular silence I'd come to associate with the cabin, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something that filled the space where sound should have been. I sat on the porch with the shotgun across my knees, watching the tree line, waiting. I almost missed it. One moment there was nothing but darkness between the pines, the kind of deep black that swallowed flashlight beams and gave nothing back. The next moment there were eyes, 2 points of amber light, maybe 50 yards out, hovering at the edge of the tree line where the scrub gave way to the denser forest. They weren't reflecting my flashlight. I hadn't turned it on. They weren't the eye shine of a deer or a wolf or anything else I'd ever seen in these woods. They generated their own glow, a soft phosphorescence that seemed to pulse slightly like a heartbeat, like breathing. And they were high, too high, 8 feet off the ground, maybe more, at a height that no animal I knew could reach without climbing. But there was no tree behind them, no rock, no structure that something could be perched on. Just those eyes, floating in the darkness, watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get in the truck and drive and never look back. But my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen on that porch, shotgun in my lap, staring at those eyes while they stared back at me with something that felt almost like recognition. Then they blinked. Not like a human blink, not even like an animal blink. They blinked sideways, the amber light sliding shut from left to right and then opening again, the way a cat's nictitating membrane passes across its eye. But slower, more deliberate, as if it wanted me to see, wanted me to understand that this was not a reflection, not a trick of the light, not something that could be explained away. The eyes held my gaze for what felt like hours but was probably seconds. Then without any sound, without any movement I could detect, they vanished. One moment they were there, burning amber holes in the darkness. The next moment there was nothing but trees and shadow and the silence pressing in from all sides. I don't remember going inside. I don't remember locking the door, pulling the heavy oak table in front of it, checking the windows to make sure they were latched. I don't remember calling Sadie's name over and over until my throat was raw, or realizing that she'd finally stopped panting in the truck and gone completely silent. I don't remember any of that, but I must have done it because when the sun came up, I was sitting on the floor with my back against the barricaded door, the shotgun clutched in my hands, every muscle in my body aching from tension. The next morning, I found Sadie unconscious in the truck, her breathing shallow, her heartbeat thready. I drove her to the emergency vet in Hayward. 45 minutes of winding roads with my old dog dying on the seat beside me. And they told me it was shock. Just shock, they said. Like it was something simple, something that happened all the time. Dogs went into shock from fear, from stress, from things their owners couldn't explain. She survived. Barely. But she was never the same after that. And she never went back to the cabin again. I should have taken that as a sign. I should have listened to the hardware store owner, to my grandfather's journal, to every instinct that was telling me to sell the place and forget about it. But I couldn't. The eyes haunted me. Waking, sleeping, it didn't matter. I saw them everywhere in the headlights of oncoming cars, in the glow of my computer screen, in the amber light of my bedside lamp. They had looked at me with something like intelligence, something like purpose, and I needed to understand what they were. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of restless nights and distracted days, of Amy's increasingly concerned phone calls and Carl's increasingly frustrated reminders that I had a job to do. I threw myself into work, trying to drown the memories in diesel fumes and transmission fluid, but nothing helped. The eyes were always there, waiting behind my eyelids every time I closed them. I went back on a Thursday night, telling no one where I was going. The drive north felt longer than usual, the highway stretching endlessly through farmland and forest. And by the time I reached the access road, it was fully dark. No moon that night, just stars scattered across a sky so black, it felt like falling into nothing. The cabin was as I'd left it, door barricaded, windows latched, cameras blinking their little red lights into the darkness. I checked the footage first, sitting in the truck with the laptop balanced on the steering wheel, and found more nothing. Days of empty clearing, empty tree line, empty forest. Whatever I'd seen 3 weeks ago had either left or learned to hide from the cameras. I didn't bother going inside. Instead, I drove the truck to the edge of the clearing, facing the tree line, and sat there with the engine running and the headlights cutting twin beams through the darkness, waiting, watching. It came out of the trees around midnight. Not the eyes this time, the whole thing, or at least enough of it to see. A shape moving between the pines, massive and wrong, catching the edge of my headlights and holding there for a single heartbeat before sliding back into shadow. I saw a silhouette, hunched shoulders, arms that hung too long, a head that was neither human nor animal, but something in between. It moved on 2 legs, then dropped to 4, then rose again with a fluidity that spoke of muscles and joints arranged in ways that shouldn't work. The size of it. I keep coming back to that, keep trying to find words that capture what I saw without sounding like a lunatic. It was big. Not bear big, not moose big. Bigger. 7 feet at the shoulder when it hunched. More when it stood. The trees around it were mature pines, 20 inches at the trunk, and it moved between them like they were nothing, like the forest itself bent to make room for it. I watched it pace the tree line for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it could hear me, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. It never came into the clearing. never stepped into the full light of the headlights. But it wanted me to see it, I was certain of that. It was showing itself deliberately, giving me just enough to know that I hadn't imagined the eyes, that something real and impossible was living in these woods. When it finally disappeared, sinking into the darkness between one breath and the next, I realized I'd stopped breathing. The air rushed back into my lungs in a ragged gasp, and I fumbled for the gear shift, ready to throw the truck into reverse and tear down the access road and never come back. But I didn't. I sat there in the dark, engine idling, staring at the place where it had been. My grandfather had seen this same thing, Hendrix too, and now me. I had a choice to make, run like they did, or stay and face whatever this was. I spent the rest of that night in the truck watching the tree line. It didn't come back. By dawn, the silence had lifted, replaced by the tentative sounds of birds beginning their morning songs, and I drove back to Madison more exhausted than I'd ever been in my life. Amy was waiting at my apartment when I got there. She had a key. I'd given it to her a year ago, back when things between us still felt like they were going somewhere. And she'd let herself in, probably planning to surprise me with breakfast, probably not expecting me to walk through the door looking like I'd spent the night wrestling demons. Nate. Her voice was careful, controlled, the way she spoke to patients at the hospital who were on the edge of breaking down. Where were you? The cabin. In the middle of the week? You didn't tell me you were going. I didn't tell anyone. She stood there in my kitchen, still in her scrubs from the night shift, her face a mixture of worry and frustration that I'd come to know too well over the past few months. You look terrible. When was the last time you slept? I don't remember. Nate, this isn't healthy. This obsession with the cabin, with whatever you think is happening up there, it's not healthy. You need to talk to someone, a professional. A professional isn't going to help. Why not? I almost told her then. The words were right there pushing against my teeth, demanding to be spoken. Because I saw something, because there's something living in those woods that shouldn't exist, because my grandfather spent 15 years running from it, and now it's found me instead. But I looked at her face, at the concern and the love and the growing fear in her eyes, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't put that burden on her, couldn't ask her to believe something that I barely believed myself. I'm just tired, I said. I'll be fine after some sleep. She didn't believe me. I could see it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her mouth pressed into a thin line. But she didn't push. Not then. She made me coffee and toast and sat with me while I ate. And when I finally crashed on the couch, she covered me with a blanket and left a note on the coffee table. Call me when you wake up. Please. I didn't call her. I slept for 16 hours straight. And when I woke up, the sun was setting, and the apartment was dark, and all I could think about was the shape I'd seen in the trees. Those hunched shoulders, those two long arms, the way it had moved between the pines like it owned them, like the forest was its domain. And I was just a trespasser. I started keeping notes after that, recording everything I could remember, trying to build a picture of something that didn't fit into any picture I knew. And through it all, I kept going back to my grandfather's journal, rereading those cryptic entries, looking for patterns. He'd seen it too. He'd tried to tell people, and they hadn't believed him, just like no one would believe me. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. Stress, grief, sleep deprivation playing tricks on an exhausted mind. But Sadie had seen it too, and dogs didn't hallucinate. Whatever was out there, it was real enough to put a 16-year-old hunting dog into shock. Real enough to make a DNR officer quit his job. Real enough to make my grandfather abandon a cabin he'd built with his own hands. I went back to the cabin the following weekend. Amy thought I was insane. Maybe I was. Sadie refused to get in the truck. She'd never loved the cabin, had been reluctant from that very first visit, slow to leave the truck, quick to retreat inside, but she'd always come along, tolerating the trip the way old dogs tolerate anything their people ask of them. This time was different. She just sat on the apartment floor and looked at me with those old brown eyes, and no amount of coaxing or treats could convince her to move. I left her with my neighbor, an elderly widow who was happy for the company, and I told myself it was probably for the best. Whatever was waiting for me up north, I didn't want Sadie anywhere near it. The cabin looked the same when I pulled up the gravel drive. Weathered boards, sagging porch, the clearing around it overgrown with late summer weeds. But something felt different. Wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The bird feeder I'd hung from the porch beam was gone. Not fallen, not knocked down by wind or animals. Just gone, the hook still screwed into the wood but empty. The feeder itself vanished without a trace. I stood in the doorway for a long time looking at that empty hook, trying to convince myself that someone must have stolen it, kids from town maybe, or some drunk hunter who thought it was funny. But I knew better. I knew because when I finally went inside, I found other things missing too. The flashlight I'd left on the kitchen counter, a pair of work gloves from the mudroom, a photograph of my grandfather that had hung on the bedroom wall since before I was born. The photograph was what got to me. It was old, faded, showing my grandfather as a young man, standing in front of this very cabin with a rifle over his shoulder and a grin on his face. I'd always loved that picture. Loved the way it captured him in his prime, before age and whatever he'd seen in these woods had worn him down. And now it was gone, taken by something that had come into my cabin while I was away, something that had walked through these rooms and touched my things and chosen what to take. I called the sheriff's office. Deputy Miller came out, a thick-shouldered man about my age with a crew cut and the kind of permanent squint that came from too many years driving into the sun. He walked through the cabin with a clipboard and a frown and absolutely no surprise on his face. He wrote down what was missing, asked if I had any enemies or ex-girlfriends who might want to mess with me, and when I told him no, he just nodded and said he'd file a report. "Don't suppose you found anything on those trail cameras?" he asked, almost casually as he was leaving. I hesitated. I still had the footage. The hours of nothing, the inexplicable gaps, the one brief clip of something moving through the trees too fast to see clearly. But I didn't tell him about any of it. Something in his tone, in the careful way he wasn't quite meeting my eyes, told me he already knew, that everyone in this town already knew, and that they'd made their peace with it a long time ago. "Nothing useful," I said, "just deer and raccoons?" He nodded again, like that was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Well, you let us know if anything else goes missing, and maybe think about getting a security system. Or a dog." "I have a dog. She won't come up here anymore." That got a reaction. A flicker of something in his eyes. There and gone so fast I might have imagined it. "Smart dog," he said, and then he was gone, his cruiser kicking up dust as he drove away down the access road. I spent the rest of that day searching the cabin and the surrounding woods, looking for any sign of where my things had gone. I found the bird feeder hanging from a branch about a quarter-mile into the forest, swinging gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The photograph was there too, tucked into a crack in the bark of a massive oak, my grandfather's faded face staring out at the trees like he was keeping watch. The flashlight and gloves I never found. It was toying with me. That was the only conclusion I could draw. Whatever was out there, it had taken my things not to keep them, but to show me that it could. To let me know that my cabin, my grandfather's cabin, wasn't really mine at all, that I was just a visitor here, tolerated for now, but never truly welcome. I should have left then. But I thought about my grandfather, how the not knowing had eaten him from the inside out, how he'd kept his secret for 15 years, and it had hollowed him into a shell. I wasn't going to let that happen to me. The rain started that night. Not a gentle autumn drizzle, but a real Wisconsin storm, the kind that turns dirt roads to rivers and makes the trees groan with the weight of water. I sat in the cabin with all the lights on, listening to the thunder roll across the sky and watching the lightning illuminate the forest in stuttered flashes of white. The power held barely, the old generator coughing and sputtering in the shed behind the cabin. I had a book open in my lap, but I wasn't reading it. I was watching the windows, waiting for something I couldn't name. Around midnight, my truck died. I didn't know it at the time, of course. Didn't know until the next morning when I went out to drive into town for supplies and found the battery drained, the engine cold, the cab filled with a smell I couldn't identify. Musky, rank, like wet dog, and something older, something that made my stomach clench and my throat tighten. Something had been inside my truck, had sat where I sat, touched what I touched, breathed the same air I breathed. I popped the hood and found the battery cables disconnected, not chewed through, not corroded. Disconnected, the clamps pulled cleanly from the terminals like something had known exactly what to do. I stared at those cables for a long time, rain streaming down my face, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Animals didn't do this, couldn't do this. This required intention, understanding, a deliberate act of sabotage, designed to strand me here in the middle of the storm. It took me 20 minutes to reconnect the cables, get the battery charged enough to turn over. The whole time I felt watched. The forest around the cabin had that quality of held breath, of waiting, even with the rain pounding down and the thunder crashing overhead. Nothing moved among the trees. No birds, no squirrels, no deer picking their way through the underbrush. Just the rain and the wind and that terrible, patient silence underneath it all. I drove into town with my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The hardware store was closed, Sunday hours, so I sat in the gas station parking lot and drank bad coffee and tried to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. Normal people going about their normal lives, completely unaware of what lived in the forest just miles away. I went back to the cabin. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving behind a forest that dripped and steamed in the sudden warmth. The access road was a mess of mud and standing water, my truck sliding and fishtailing as I navigated the ruts. More than once I thought I'd have to get out and push, but each time the tires caught at the last moment, pulling me forward through the muck. The cabin was as I'd left it, door locked, windows intact, no sign of intrusion. But when I went to start the generator, I found a dead rabbit on the fuel tank. Not killed by predators, not caught in a trap, arranged. Its eyes had been removed, leaving two dark sockets that stared up at the gray sky. Its belly had been slit open and emptied, the cavity stuffed with leaves and moss and something else, something that glittered wetly in the dim light. Teeth. Small ones. Probably from rodents. Dozens of them packed into the rabbit's open stomach like offerings at some terrible altar. I stumbled back from the generator, my boot catching on a root, sending me sprawling in the wet grass. For a long moment I just lay there, staring at the dead rabbit, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't predation. This wasn't instinct or hunger or any animal behavior I'd ever heard of. This was ritual. This was deliberate. This was something with intelligence and intention and a message it wanted to deliver. I was being hunted. Not for food, not for territory. Hunted for reasons I couldn't begin to understand, by something that played with its prey, like a cat with a mouse, that drew out the fear and the anticipation because it enjoyed them. My hands were shaking as I pushed myself to my feet, shaking as I went back to the cabin and locked the door behind me, shaking as I pulled my grandfather's double barrel from the closet where I'd stashed it after my last visit, and loaded both chambers with the buckshot shells I'd bought on a whim weeks ago, never really expecting to use them. The weight of it in my hands was reassuring. Cold steel and polished wood, something solid and real in a world that had become a nightmare. I sat in the main room with the gun across my knees, watching the windows, watching the door, waiting for something to happen. That was the first night of what would become 4 straight days and nights at the cabin. The longest I'd ever stayed, and the last. The light outside faded from gray to darker gray to black, the forest swallowing what remained of the day. I didn't turn on the lights, didn't start the generator. Sat in the darkness and listened to the cabin settle around me, every creak and groan a potential threat, every shadow a possible hiding place. It came at dusk on that first night, that liminal hour between day and night when the world holds its breath and anything seems possible. I was at the window watching the tree line when I saw it move. Not the eyes this time. Not the silhouette against the sky. I saw it clearly, or as clearly as the failing light would allow. A shape emerging from between 2 massive pines, moving with a kind of fluid grace that made my stomach turn. It was on all fours, or mostly on all fours, its front limbs bending in ways that limbs shouldn't bend, its body low to the ground like a predator stalking prey. And then it rose. I will never forget watching it rise, the way the front limbs straightened and became arms, the way the spine shifted and realigned, the way it went from quadruped to biped in a single smooth motion like a man standing up from a crouch. But this was no man. Even in the dim light, even through the dirty glass of the cabin window, I could see that this was something else entirely. The snout came first into focus, long and angular, filled with teeth that caught what little light remained and glinted like knives. The fur was dark, almost black, slicked down with rain or mist or something else, matted in places where I could see the skin beneath, gray and mottled like old leather. The shoulders were massive, corded with muscle that bunched and flexed as it moved, wider than any man's should be, wider than any animal's I'd ever seen. And the hands, God, the hands were the worst part. Long fingers tipped with claws bending backward at the first joint, gripping a tree trunk as it steadied itself on 2 legs. Fingers that could wrap around a man's throat and squeeze. Fingers that could peel bark from wood or flesh from bone with equal ease. It stood there at the edge of the clearing, looking at the cabin, looking at me, And even though I knew it couldn't see me in the darkness, even though I told myself I was invisible behind the window, I felt its attention like a physical weight. It knew I was there. It had always known. The snout opened and closed, tasting the air. Those terrible fingers flexed and unflexed against the bark, and then slowly, deliberately, it raised one hand and pointed directly at my window. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, the shotgun forgotten in my hands. Seconds, maybe. Minutes. Time had stopped meaning anything. The creature lowered its arm and stood watching for a moment longer, and then it turned and melted back into the trees, gone as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving nothing but the memory of those glinting teeth and those awful knowing eyes. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even try. I sat with my back against the wall and the shotgun in my lap and waited for it to come through the door, through the windows, through the goddamn walls if it wanted to. But it didn't come. It let me sit there in the dark, let me marinate in my fear, let me understand exactly how helpless I was against something that could point at me through a window, that could take my things and kill rabbits and disconnect my battery cables like it was playing a game. Because it was a game. I understood that now. It had been a game from the very beginning. The deer carcass, the trail cameras, the missing items, all of it designed to terrify me, to show me that I was nothing, that my locks and my weapons and my desperate attempts to understand were meaningless against something so far beyond my comprehension. It could have killed me any time it wanted, could have torn through the cabin door and ripped me apart like it had ripped apart that deer. But it hadn't. It had let me live, let me run, let me come back again and again like a mouse, returning to a trap it didn't understand. Why? What did it want from me? I thought about my grandfather's journal, those cryptic entries about the Watcher. I thought about the phrase he'd circled, the one I'd dismissed as the ramblings of an old man losing his grip on reality. It only takes the ones who run. What did that mean? That running triggered some predatory instinct? Some chase response? That standing your ground was the key to survival? Or was it something else entirely? Something deeper and stranger that I couldn't begin to grasp? Dawn came eventually, gray light seeping through the windows, revealing a cabin that looked exactly as it had the night before. No scratches on the door, no broken glass, no sign that anything had tried to get in. I made coffee with hands that still trembled, drank it too hot and barely noticed. The shotgun stayed within arm's reach. Around noon, I used the satellite communicator to try Amy. The call went to voicemail. She was probably at work, probably screening my calls after the way I'd been acting lately. I left a message trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like a man on the edge of a breakdown. Hey, it's me. I'm at the cabin. I wanted to hear your voice. Call me back when you can. She didn't call back. I waited all day, checking my phone every few minutes, jumping at every notification that turned out to be spam or news alerts or anything other than her name on the screen. By evening, I'd given up hope. She was done with me, not officially, not yet, but the distance had been growing for weeks, and this was just another step in the slow process of letting go. I tried the DNR next on the satellite phone. Got a recording saying the office was closed. Please leave a message and someone would return my call during normal business hours. I called the sheriff's department and asked for Deputy Miller, and the dispatcher told me he was out on patrol. But she could take a message if I wanted. I didn't want. What would I say? Hey, remember that thing I told you wasn't on my trail cameras? Well, I saw it last night, and it's 7 feet tall, and it pointed at me like it knows exactly where I am and what I'm doing. And I think it's going to kill me, but I don't know when or why or how to stop it. They'd send someone out, sure. Someone with a psych evaluation and a pair of handcuffs, ready to take the crazy man away for his own good. I was alone. Truly, completely alone. On my second night stuck in a cabin in the middle of the Wisconsin Northwoods with a monster that was playing games with me, and no one who could help, even if they believed me. The realization settled over me like a weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. This was how my grandfather had felt, wasn't it? This isolation, this creeping madness, this certainty that something impossible was real and that no one would ever believe him if he tried to explain. He had run. He had abandoned the cabin and never come back. Had spent 15 years pretending that whatever he'd seen didn't exist. And maybe that was the smart play. Maybe running was the only sane response to something this far outside the bounds of normal reality. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't give up. Couldn't accept that the world I thought I knew was a lie and just walk away from the truth. The creature was real. It was intelligent. It was hunting me for reasons I didn't understand. And if I was going to survive, if I was going to make it out of this with my life and my sanity intact, I needed to understand it. Needed to find some weakness, some vulnerability, some way to turn the tables on something that had been playing with me like a toy. I went back to my grandfather's journal, read every entry again, looking for patterns I'd missed, clues I'd overlooked. He'd seen the thing too, that much was certain now. He'd called it the Watcher, and he'd written about it in the same terrified, uncertain terms I was using in my own notes. But there was something else in his entries, something I'd dismissed before as the ramblings of an old man. It only takes the ones who run. I'd assumed he meant running away, fleeing, abandoning the cabin like he eventually did. But what if that wasn't it? What if running meant something else? Fear, maybe, or panic, or that primal flight response that every animal has hardwired into its brain? What if the creature fed on fear, hunted those who showed weakness, and spared those who stood their ground? It was a theory, nothing more, a guess based on a single cryptic phrase in a dead man's journal. But it was all I had, and it was better than sitting in the dark, waiting to die. The second night of my stay was worse than the first. The creature didn't show itself, didn't make its presence known in any obvious way, but I could feel it out there circling, watching, patient as stone. Every sound from the forest made me jump. Every shadow that moved across the windows sent my heart racing. I stayed awake until my eyes burned and my thoughts started to fragment, drifting in and out of a half-conscious state where the line between reality and nightmare blurred to nothing. Sometime after midnight, I heard scratching at the back door. Not loud, not aggressive, just a slow, deliberate rasp of claws on wood like something testing the strength of the barrier, feeling out the weaknesses. I raised the shotgun, aiming at the door, waiting for it to burst inward in a shower of splinters, but it didn't. The scratching continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Silence. Then footsteps heavy and slow, circling the cabin. I tracked them by sound. Back door to side, window to front porch, to the other side window, and back to the rear again. It was walking around me, keeping me awake, keeping me scared, reminding me that there was nowhere to run and no way to hide. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I heard breathing, deep, wet, rasping, and then a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could come from a throat built for tearing flesh. A low, rumbling chuckle that vibrated through the door and into my bones. "What do you want?" My voice came out cracked, barely a whisper. "What the hell do you want from me?" No answer. The breathing continued for a moment longer, then faded, the footsteps retreating into the forest until all that remained was silence. I sat there shaking, the shotgun heavy in my hands, and waited for the dawn. The next morning I found claw marks on every door and window of the cabin. Not deep enough to break through, not aggressive enough to constitute a real attack, just scratches, shallow grooves in the old wood. Proof that it had been here, that it had touched every entrance while I cowered inside. A reminder that the walls meant nothing to it, that it could come in whenever it wanted, and the only reason I was still alive was because it hadn't decided to kill me yet. I tried to leave then. Packed my bag, loaded the truck, got as far as the end of the access road before the engine died again. Same as before. Battery drained, cables disconnected. That musky smell filling the cab like a signature. I sat there for a long time staring at the steering wheel, understanding at last what should have been obvious from the beginning. It wasn't going to let me leave. Whatever game it was playing, whatever purpose I served in its alien mind, it needed me here. In this cabin, in this forest, close enough to touch whenever it decided the time was right. I walked back to the cabin as the sun climbed higher in the sky, my bag over my shoulder, my grandfather's shotgun in my hands. The forest watched me go, silent and patient, waiting to see what I would do next. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than fear. I felt anger, a cold, hard fury that burned through the panic and the desperation and left something sharp behind. This thing, this creature, this monster that had tormented my grandfather and was now tormenting me, it thought it was in control. It thought I was just another mouse in its trap, another plaything to be toyed with and discarded. But I was done being afraid, done running, done cowering, done playing by its rules. If it wanted a game, I would give it a game. And maybe I would lose, probably I would lose, but at least I would go down fighting. At least I would face the thing that haunted my grandfather's nightmares and look it in its amber eyes and show it that I was not prey to be hunted, not a victim to be savored, not something to be broken and discarded. I was Nathan Windrider, and this was my cabin, and if the thing in the forest wanted me, it was going to have to come and get me. The waiting was the hardest part. I spent the third day of my stay preparing, reinforcing the doors as best I could, moving furniture to create barricades, positioning the flashlight and the shotgun and the hunting knife my grandfather had left behind. I found loose pages torn from his journal hidden under the floorboards. Entries he'd ripped out and stashed separately like he didn't want them found with the rest. They described encounters and theories, and finally, a single phrase circled in red ink. It only takes the ones who run. I understood now. Or I thought I did. My grandfather had figured out the rules of this nightmare, had found a way to survive long enough to escape. And then he'd run anyway, unable to face another night in this cabin, another season in these woods. He'd lived out the rest of his life in fear, jumping at shadows, never quite free of the thing he'd left behind. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. When the creature came, and it would come, I was sure of that now. I was going to stand my ground and look it in the eyes and see what happened next. Either the theory was right and I would survive, or it was wrong and I would die. Either way, at least I would know. Either way, at least I would finally have an answer. It came for me on the fourth night. I was ready. Or I thought I was ready. I'd spent the entire day in a state of focused calm, a strange peace settling over me as I accepted what was about to happen. The cabin was as fortified as I could make it. Furniture piled against the back door. The bedroom barricaded with the heavy oak dresser my grandfather had built decades ago, every weapon I had within arm's reach. The shotgun was loaded with buckshot, both barrels, and I had my grandfather's hunting knife strapped to my belt. Not much of an arsenal against whatever that thing was, but it was what I had. The sun set around 6:30, painting the forest in shades of orange and purple before the darkness swallowed everything whole. I sat in the main room, with my back to the bedroom door, watching the windows, listening to the silence that had become my constant companion. The fire crackled in the wood stove, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I'd built it high, wanting the light, wanting the warmth, wanting something human and normal to hold on to while I waited for the monster to come. The first sign was the silence deepening. I hadn't thought it was possible for the forest to get any quieter, but somehow it did. The distant sounds of the wind in the trees faded away. The occasional creak of settling wood disappeared. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. It was as if someone had thrown a blanket over the world, muffling everything except the thundering of my own heart. Then the scratching started again, but different this time. Not the teasing, testing scratches of the previous nights. This was purposeful, insistent. A steady rasp against the back door that spoke of intention rather than intimidation. I heard wood splintering, then a crash, as the furniture I'd piled there went tumbling across the floor. The barricade hadn't lasted 30 seconds. I was already on my feet, the shotgun raised, backing toward the bedroom as the back door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and cold night air. And then I saw it, all of it, the full nightmare made flesh. It had to duck to fit through the doorway, folding its massive frame to squeeze through an opening built for humans. 7 feet tall at least, maybe more. It was hard to judge with the way it hunched forward, shoulders too wide for its height, arms that hung almost to its knees when it straightened. The arms were wrong. Wronger than anything I'd seen before. Too long, jointed in too many places, ending in hands that looked almost human except for the fingers that bent backward at the last knuckle, tipped with claws like yellowed bone. Its legs were digitigrade, bent at angles that shouldn't have supported its weight, but somehow did, thick with muscle that rippled under fur the color of wet coal. But the worst part was the face. God, the face. I'd seen glimpses of it before, the snout, the teeth, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of seeing it head on, framed by the ruined doorway, illuminated by the flickering firelight. It was a wolf's face stretched over something that wasn't a wolf, features elongated and distorted into something almost mechanical in its wrongness. The snout was too long, filled with teeth that overlapped and jutted at angles that defied biology, strings of saliva hanging between jaws that could have crushed a man's skull like an egg. Its eyes were set forward, predator's eyes, burning with that amber light I'd come to know so well. They were intelligent, aware, ancient in a way that made my skin crawl, carrying knowledge and hunger and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. It stood in my grandfather's cabin, this thing that had haunted my family for generations, and it looked at me with those terrible eyes, and I swear to God it smiled. "You're real," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange in my own ears. "You're actually real." The creature tilted its head, a gesture I'd seen dogs make 1,000 times, but that looked profoundly wrong on this massive, nightmarish frame. It took a step forward, and the floor groaned under its weight. Another step, and I could smell it, that musky copper scent mixed with something else, something ancient and wild and utterly inhuman. Its breath came in slow, rumbling exhalations, each one carrying the stench of old blood and decay. I should have fired. Everything I'd read about survival, everything my grandfather had taught me about hunting, every instinct I had was screaming at me to pull the trigger. But I didn't. I remembered the journal, the phrase circled in red ink, the theory that had become my only hope. It only takes the ones who run. So I didn't run. I didn't shoot. I stood my ground, the shotgun still raised, but my finger resting alongside the trigger guard instead of on it, and I looked that monster in its amber eyes, and I waited. The creature stopped. That massive head tilted the other way, and I saw something shift in its expression. Confusion, maybe, or surprise. It wasn't used to this. Its prey ran, its victims screamed and fled and made themselves small, and it hunted them down and did whatever terrible things it did to them. But I wasn't running. I wasn't screaming. I was just standing there, heart hammering against my ribs, sweat dripping down my back, every muscle in my body wound tight enough to snap, but standing. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, man and monster face to face in a cabin that had seen this confrontation before, would probably see it again long after I was dead and gone. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the broken door, and the creature studied me with those ancient, hungry eyes, weighing me, measuring me, deciding what to do with a mouse that wouldn't run. Then it moved. It was faster than anything that size should have been able to move. 1 second it was standing by the ruined back door. The next, it had crossed the entire room and slammed into me with the force of a car crash. I went flying, the shotgun spinning out of my grip, and I hit the bedroom door frame, hard enough to feel something crack in my chest. Pain exploded through my torso, white hot and blinding, and I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue on impact. I slid down the wall, gasping, and the creature loomed over me. It grabbed my arm with one of those terrible backward-bending hands, the claws digging into my flesh, and lifted me off the ground like I weighed nothing. The pain was incredible. I could feel those claws scraping against bone, could feel blood running hot down my arm. But somehow I held on to consciousness. Somehow I forced myself to meet its eyes. "I'm not running," I whispered through gritted teeth. Blood flecked my lips. "Do what you want. I'm not going to run." The creature's lips peeled back from those impossible teeth, and that rumbling chuckle vibrated through its chest again. Up close, I could see details I wished I couldn't. The way individual hairs moved in its breath, the deep scars that crossed its snout from encounters I couldn't imagine, the intelligence in those burning eyes that was somehow worse than if they'd been empty and animalistic. It knew what it was doing. It understood. and it was enjoying this. It pulled me closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its body, close enough that its breath washed over my face in hot, fetid waves. The snout opened wider, those overlapping teeth parting, and I thought, this is it. This is how I die. In the jaws of something that shouldn't exist, in the cabin my grandfather fled 15 years ago. The shotgun. Where was the shotgun? My eyes found it without consciously looking, lying against the far wall where it landed when I was thrown, too far to reach. But the creature was focused on me, on my face, on whatever it saw when it looked into my eyes. It wasn't watching the room. It wasn't being careful. My right hand found my belt, found the handle of my grandfather's hunting knife. I didn't think. Thinking would have gotten me killed. I just acted, pulling the knife free and driving it up and into the creature's throat in one desperate motion. The blade sank deep, meeting resistance, and then punching through, and hot blood, dark, almost black in the firelight, sprayed across my face and chest. The creature screamed. It was the worst sound I've ever heard. Not a howl, not a roar, but a scream, high and keening and almost human in its pain, cutting through the silence of the forest, like a knife through flesh. The grip on my arm loosened and I fell, hitting the floor hard, rolling away from those slashing claws as the creature staggered backward, one hand clutching at the knife still buried in its throat. I scrambled across the room on hands and knees, ribs screaming, arm leaving a trail of blood on the wooden floor. The shotgun was right there, right where it had fallen, and I grabbed it with shaking hands and spun around, just as the creature wrenched the knife free and threw it aside. Blood poured from the wound, black and steaming, but it wasn't enough. Whatever this thing was, a knife wound wasn't going to stop it. It was already recovering, those amber eyes finding me again, narrowing with rage and something that might have been respect. It started toward me. I didn't aim for its body. I didn't aim for its head. I aimed at the ceiling and pulled both triggers, and the shotgun roared like God himself was clearing his throat. And the ceiling above the creature exploded in a rain of splintered wood and shattered plaster. The creature froze. I cracked the breech, thumbed out the spent shells, and loaded 2 more with hands that shook so badly I could barely grip them. I snapped it shut and aimed at the ceiling again. "I'm not running," I said, and my voice was steadier than it had any right to be. I kicked the wood stove door open with my boot. Coals spilled across the dry pine floor, and a tongue of flame licked up immediately. "But I will burn this whole fucking place down around both of us if you don't back off." The creature looked at me, just looked at me, those amber eyes unreadable, blood still pouring from its throat in a steady stream. I could see the wound closing, not fast, but visibly, the flesh knitting together in ways that flesh shouldn't knit. Whatever this thing was, it healed fast, faster than anything natural, but not instant, not invulnerable. I had heard it. I had actually heard it. "You can leave," I said, "or we can find out how fast you heal when you're buried under a burning building. Your choice." For a long, terrible moment, I thought it was going to call my bluff. I thought it was going to cross the remaining distance between us and finish what it started, and I was going to have to make good on my threat and die in the ruins of my grandfather's cabin. But then it did something I didn't expect. It tilted its head, that same eerily familiar gesture, and it made a sound that wasn't a growl, wasn't a laugh, wasn't anything I had words for. A sound of acknowledgement, maybe, of recognition. And then it turned and walked out through the broken back door and disappeared into the night. I sat there for a long time, shotgun still raised, staring at the empty doorway and the darkness beyond. The fire was dying, the cold creeping in through the ruined door, but I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there and shake and bleed and try to process what had just happened. I had faced it, I'd heard it, and I was still alive. Dawn came eventually, the way dawn always does, gray light filtering through the windows and chasing away the shadows. I got up slowly, every movement an agony, and surveyed the damage. The back door was destroyed, the bedroom door frame cracked, blood everywhere, mine and its. My arm was still bleeding sluggishly, deep puncture wounds that probably needed stitches, and every breath sent lightning bolts of pain through my chest, where my ribs had cracked against the door frame. But I was alive. Against all odds, against all reason, I was alive. I found my keys, found my bag, found my grandfather's journal. I popped the hood before turning the key. Old habit by now. The battery cables were still connected. It hadn't touched the truck this time. The engine turned over on the first try, and somehow I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that it wouldn't stop me from leaving. Not now. Not after what had happened. I drove 40 miles to the nearest hospital in Rhinelander, every bump in the road sending fresh waves of pain through my battered body. When they asked what happened, I told them I'd crashed my truck on an icy road, that I'd been thrown against the steering wheel, that I'd crawled through the broken windshield to get help. They looked skeptical. The scratches on my arm didn't look like they'd come from glass, and the hospital was too far from any crash site. But they didn't push. They just treated my injuries, wrapped my ribs, stitched my arm, and sent me on my way with a prescription for painkillers and a warning to take it easy. I didn't report what really happened. How could I? What would I have said? That a 7-foot werewolf broke into my cabin, that I stabbed it in the throat and shot holes in my ceiling, that it walked away and left me alive for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. I would have ended up in a psychiatric ward instead of a hospital bed. My story dismissed as a delusion or a breakdown or a symptom of grief-induced psychosis. The DNR officer had known. The people in town had known. And they didn't talk about it, which told me everything I needed to know about what happened to people who did. I spent 3 days in a motel in Rhinelander, healing and thinking and trying to decide what to do next. I called in sick to work, sent vague texts to Amy about needing some time, stared at the walls of my rented room and replayed the encounter over and over in my mind. The eyes, the teeth, the way it had looked at me, studied me, let me go. The phrase in my grandfather's journal. It only takes the ones who run. I hadn't run, and it had let me live. On the 4th day, I called a real estate company in Madison and told them I wanted to sell the cabin. They sent someone up to assess it. A young guy who seemed uncomfortable in the woods, who looked at the damage and the remoteness and offered me a price that was insultingly low. I took it anyway. The logging company that eventually bought the land paid slightly more, enough to cover my hospital bills with a little left over. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted it gone. I went back one more time, 2 weeks after the attack, to clean out anything worth saving. The cabin felt different in the daylight, smaller somehow, sadder, just an old wooden structure, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I packed up my grandfather's tools, his books, the few photographs that hadn't yellowed beyond recognition. The Remington went into the truck bed, wrapped in an old blanket. I wasn't leaving it behind. Everything else I left for the new owners or the elements or whatever came to claim it. The last thing I took was the journal. I've read it cover to cover 100 times since then, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what my grandfather knew and what he was trying to tell me. There are entries that span decades, describing encounters and near misses and a theory that he never quite proved, that the creature, he called it the Watcher, had been in these woods for as long as anyone could remember, that it hunted according to rules only it understood, that running triggered something in it, some predator instinct that couldn't be resisted. Stay still, stay calm, don't run, and maybe it would let you go. He'd survived 15 encounters before he finally broke. From what I can piece together, the creature left him alone for decades. He'd spent 30-odd summers at the cabin in peace before it started showing itself. Then, in those last few years, the encounters came fast and close together. 15 times he'd faced that thing and walked away, and then one night, for reasons he doesn't explain, he ran. He ran all the way back to Madison and never returned. I think I understand now. It wasn't the creature that broke him. It was the knowledge, the certainty that he would have to face it again if he stayed, that every season he spent in that cabin was another chance for things to go wrong, another opportunity to make a mistake and trigger that hunting instinct. He got tired of being brave, tired of standing his ground, tired of looking into those amber eyes and waiting to see if this would be the time it decided to end things. So he left. I don't blame him. I can't blame him. Because 3 months after I sold the cabin, I transferred to a trucking company in Tucson, Arizona, as far from the Wisconsin North Woods as I could get without leaving the country. Amy left me 2 weeks before the move. We'd been having problems for a while. She'd accused me of being distant, preoccupied, unable to talk about what was happening in my head. But the final straw was when she found the shotgun I'd started keeping by the bed. "You've changed," she said, and she was crying. And I wanted to tell her everything, wanted to explain why I couldn't sleep without a weapon within reach, why I jumped at every shadow, why I spent hours on the internet reading about cryptid sightings and ancient legends and creatures that walked the edge of human knowledge. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because telling her would mean admitting it was real. And admitting it was real would mean accepting that I would never really be free of it, no matter how far I ran. "I'm sorry," was all I said. She deserved better. She deserved the man I'd been before, the practical, grounded guy who believed in what he could see and touch and explain. That man was gone, replaced by someone who knew the world was bigger and darker and stranger than he'd ever imagined. I didn't argue when she left. I just watched her go and started packing for Arizona. It's been 2 years now. I live in a small apartment on the outskirts of Tucson, work the night shift at a distribution center, sleep during the day when most people are awake and the desert sun makes everything feel bright and safe. I don't have many friends here. It's hard to get close to people when you can't tell them the truth about your life, but Ma, I have routines, have work, have a kind of peace that I never thought I'd find again. Some nights are harder than others. I still dream about the cabin, about amber eyes in the darkness, about teeth that shouldn't fit in any mouth and hands that bend backward at impossible angles. I wake up sweating, heart pounding, certain that something is watching me from the corner of my bedroom or outside my window or just beyond the edge of my vision. The feeling fades with the sunrise, but it never quite goes away. I've done research, hundreds of hours of it, tracking down stories and legends and accounts from people who've seen things they can't explain. Dogmen, they call them sometimes. Werewolves, skinwalkers, beast of Bray Road. The names change depending on who's telling the story, but the descriptions are always similar. Too tall, too strong, eyes that glow in the dark, intelligence that goes beyond any natural animal. They've been reported in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, throughout the northern woods and beyond. Ancient Native American legends speak of shapeshifters and spirit creatures that walked between worlds. European settlers brought their own stories, their own fears, their own encounters with things that hunted the night. None of it explains what I saw. The mystery remains, and I've made peace with the fact that it always will. I keep my grandfather's journal on my nightstand. I read it sometimes when the nightmares are bad, tracing his handwriting. He left me the only inheritance that really mattered. The knowledge that surviving isn't about being strong or fast or smart. It's about staying still when every instinct screams at you to run. The shotgun stays by my bed. Old habits. My name is Nathan Windrider. People call me Nate. I'm 34 years old. I live in Tucson, Arizona because something in the Wisconsin North Woods decided to let me go, and I was smart enough to stay gone. I think of my grandfather sometimes in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, the courage it took, the toll it extracted. He stayed for 15 encounters before he broke. I only lasted one, but one was enough. The cabin is gone now, torn down by the logging company, the land cleared and replanted with managed timber that will never grow old enough to hold shadows. And if you're listening to this because you saw something you can't explain, don't run. Look it in the eye and stand your ground. It's the only chance you've got. Somewhere out there, in the dark places, something with amber eyes is waiting. It's always waiting.